episode 1 of Lost in the Warp. My name is Ethan, this is my co-host Riley.
Hello, I'm Riley.
And we would like to welcome you to our first official episode. To get us started for today, we have a quote to kind of set the stage.
They shall be my finest warriors, these men who give themselves to me. Like clay I shall mold them, and in the furnace of war forge them. They will be of iron will and steely muscle. In great armor shall I clad them, and with the mightiest guns will they be armed. They will be untouched by plague or disease. No sickness will blight them. They will have tactics, strategies, and machines such that no foe can best them in battle. They are my bulwark against the terror. They are the defenders of humanity. They are my Space Marines, and they shall know no fear. The Emperor of Mankind. So, if you haven't already guessed, today we'll be talking about Space Marines. Specifically, we're going to talk about Intercessors, the newish, Primaris version of Tactical Marines. But since we're in 10th edition, we're going to talk Primaris specific. These are the rank and file troops of the Space Marines that we see all the time. And we're going to, look at the lore, see how they're depicted, what they carry, all that. And then we're going to look at the tabletop, how they perform, what their data sheet looks like, and then maybe do some comparison and discussion on that. So, Ethan, please talk us through the lore.
Yeah, so just to kind of get a broad explanation of the faction out of the way, there originally were 18 or 20, depending on who you ask, legions of Space Marines that were created by the Emperor from genetic code of each of the legion's primarchs, which were essentially his gene children, quote unquote, that he made in the laboratories of Terra, and from there formed the Space Marine legions. And each of these legions had their own specialities in combat that went along with their primarchs. For example, the Space Wolves. They were very much the Emperor's executioners. He would send them in to do dirty work that not necessarily other legions couldn't handle, but that other legions weren't necessarily as suited for. They pushed out from Terra and took over the stars on the Emperor's Great Crusade and essentially conquered world after world with superhuman abilities that he gave them in their gene crafting. These, again, are not Primaris Marines yet. These are still the Crusade and Horus Heresy era firstborn Marines. After the Horus Heresy happened, the Loyalist Marine legions that were left were divided into chapters according to Gilliman's Codex Astartes. The book. According to the Codex, each chapter could only be 1,000 Marines strong unless they were on a crusade. Black Templars, we're looking at you. There have been 26 foundings of Space Marines since then, with many, many, many chapters founded after that.
No one really knows the exact number.
People say that there's specific numbers, but it's GW.
It's more than 1,000. We know that.
There's a lot of Space Marine chapters. Essentially scouring the galaxy in search of the alien, traitor, and mutant to bring the glory of the Emperor and unite humanity. Vehicles and troops available to Space Marines are just about as diverse as the chapters themselves, depending on, what that chapter is specifically doing. Now that we're in the era of Primaris, specifically Intercessors are your general rank and file that carry the brunt of the load in the Space Marine chapters. Depending on which company they may be in, chapters are organized differently. But your generic Intercessor is kind of like your Swiss Army knife. He's good at just about everything, but he's not great at do anything relatively well. He's not necessarily made for a specific role. He's made to be that jack of all trades. Recently in the lore is where we have come across Primaris Space Marines. They were mass-produced thanks to the efforts of Belisarius Cawl. Cawl does Cawl things.
Praise.
For those who don't know, Belisarius Cawl is a member of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He was commissioned by Rabute Gilliman in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy to create this new generation of Space Marines. And in the 10,000 years since, he has perfected them and turned them into the killing machines that Gilliman had ordered back in that time. These Primaris Marines are taking the role of tactical Marines that the Firstborns are known for, specifically trying to essentially phase the old Legion style out and bring, that kind of chapter identity into the forefront.
Yeah, and we'll get to in a little bit when talking about the lore. We'll discuss how that transition has gone and where we are now with the status of Primaris versus Firstborn Marines.
Right, and this is just a general overview of Space Marines as a whole. Obviously, different chapters and different groups have their own special organizations. Some haven't been completely reinforced by Primaris Marines yet. It varies based on chapter, and we'll get into that here in a little bit later. But for now, let's move into the equipment and armaments that for the Primaris Marines are equipped with.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the Mark 10 Tacticus armor that Primaris Marines wear. So there are different variants of the same mark of armor worn depending on the combat role of the Marine. So we have intercessor squads and hellblasters and Primaris officers that wear Tacticus, but there's also like the other stuff includes Gravis armor and Phobos armor, stuff like that.
Right, and you can kind of visualize Tacticus if you've ever played games like Space Marine 2 or generally seen any recent Warhammer media. It's what you see most Space Marines wearing nowadays. It still kind of keeps with that classic look, but it's a little bit larger in terms of proportion as the Space Marine itself is larger.
Yes, yes. It is what most of your poster and box art will depict. So the armor itself has sloped pauldrons that the wearers are specifically trained to use in ways that create angles that deflect enemy fire. The chest plate is the thickest layer of ceramite in the armor. And not only does it protect like the wearer and the organs of the wearer, and Space Marines have a lot of organs, but it also protects the power cables and the power systems of the armor itself. The greaves, or the legs of the armor, they have gyroscopic stabilizers. These help improve balance and movement while in the fight. And the knee plates extend a little bit upwards to help protect vulnerable joints. Kind of a cool thing, in my opinion. The boots got magnetic soles that can be turned on or off for extra stability in slippery places, or if they're in zero G fighting out in space. You know, that's why they're called Space Marines, I guess. And the big one, the backpack, the power pack. This is the lifeblood of the armor. It contains the power supply. In lore, it is a subatomic microfusion reactor. It also includes a backup micro solar array that can charge reserve power systems. The pack contains all life support and temperature control systems, allowing the Marines to survive in nearly all environments possible. The life support and temperature control itself keeps a constant temperature inside the suit of armor. It will only change by like 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, no matter where Space Marines are. It's some pretty advanced stuff. And last, we're going to talk about the helmet. The helmet contains most of the combat-relating systems. This includes your Auspex, your Vox, magnification systems for visuals, a compass, any tactical information that is being communicated, and it has armor and environmental diagnostic information. So think of it, it's your HUD in a video game. It's the display that gives you anything and everything you need to know that will help you get through this fight, get where you need to go, communicate with your team.
I think the most interesting part about the armor to me, which is something that I always thought was kind of silly until I learned why it existed, was the pauldrons. Yeah. Because if you look at Space Marines, they have the massive shoulder pads.
They're super bulky.
That just look ridiculous. But when you realize, oh, they're just supposed to be built-in shields that you lower your shoulder into an oncoming hit and it takes the impact instead of having to carry a shield on your arm or something, it makes a lot more sense and actually doesn't just look like something ridiculous. It actually has a function. It's not just this cool design feature.
Yeah, and not only is it a shield, it's also a battering ram. You can run through a lot of stuff. So, yeah, that's the brief overview on the armor that these Primaris Marines wear. Ethan, I think you'd like to cover our weapon systems.
Yeah, weapon systems. Not a lot has changed between the Primaris and the Firstborn Marines in terms of weapons. The biggest change has been the bolt rifle that they carry. Your tactical Marines generally carried the standard bolt gun of various patterns, but now Primaris Marines carry the Mark II call pattern bolt rifle. It is essentially the same idea as the bolt gun. It used to be. It's a 75 cal projectile, so it's a large projectile. It's
It big.
it is very big. It's a mass reactive rocket propelled shell. Essentially, the bolter is a grenade launcher
Oh yeah, 100%.
with armor penetration. And
Fun.
that is, while very fun, also very terrifying to think about. The call pattern bolt rifle is slightly longer than older patterns of bolt rifles, meaning it has slightly longer range, and it is extremely modular so that it can be modified. So in any tactical situation that you might find yourself in, you can modify your weapon to fit that. Speaking of modifications for it, there's a couple different patterns that come out of that, like the auto bolt rifle. It's just another variant of that bolt rifle that's built specifically so it has a larger magazine and a higher fire rate so that it can do rapid fire suppression and really hold a position better versus, say, the stalker bolt rifle, another variant, which is more long ranged. Its magazine isn't necessarily extended, but they've equipped scopes and other things to allow it to be used at a longer range.
Yeah, and that's like your designated marksman rifle. And then your
Right.
auto bolt rifle is, your heavy gunner for the squad. They can put down a little more fire.
Right. So those are the main armaments, but intercessors are generally able to take other armaments as well. Some specialty weapons, sidearms, things like that. Things like the bolt pistol. It's a bolter, but it's a pistol. It's very small. It really hasn't changed much since ever. It's pretty much the same patterns. They do also have other sidearms, such as the plasma pistol, that generally officers and sergeants get to use. It's a very powerful but dangerous pistol that uses microfusion nuclear reactions to superheat a cartridge of gas within the weapon into a state of matter known as plasma, as the name plasma pistol suggests,
I would assume so.
and then release it in a concentrated blast to essentially turn whatever is in front of it into a no longer solid state. I don't really know exactly how the science works on that one, but it's cool.
Yeah, it's very cool.
As a guard player, I love my plasma.
I love my hell blasters. They're so useful.
We'll get to those at some point, but plasma is one of the quickest ways to my heart. I love plasma. It's great. I don't understand it, but it's really funny. They also are equipped with grenades, as any infantry should be. They have two different variations. There's the crack grenade and the frag grenade. The frag grenade is pretty self-explanatory. It's something that militaries have been using for a long time currently, and it's just been extrapolated into the 41st millennium. It's essentially an explosive core surrounded by a ceramic coating that when it explodes, it turns into shrapnel and makes everything around it Swiss cheese.
Cheese.
Yay.
And then you also do have the crack grenade, which is 40K's equivalent of C4, essentially. It's a
Yay.
shaped charge that you attach to something, either via a magnetic, adhesive, or physical, like clamp, and then it goes off and uses essentially an armor-piercing charge to penetrate armor and destroy what's within.
Yeah, it's your sticky grenade.
It really it is.
Yeah.
Like if anyone has played Space Marine 2, you've used the crack grenade, you've noticed that when you throw it at something, it sticks to it. That's kind of the idea. Is it's an armor-piercing grenade that sticks to whatever it's thrown at and blows a massive hole in it.
Yeah.
Moving on to melee weapons, though, generally in a unit of intercessors, the sergeant will have some kind of melee weapon, whether it be a chainsword, for example, one of the most iconic 40K weapons in general. It's a chainsaw, but it's not for trees. It's for that guy over there that you don't like. It's a giant chainsaw with monomolecular teeth, so that it's exceedingly sharp, and it's not a clean weapon. It is meant to be brutal. It is meant to bite, tear, and eviscerate whatever is in front of it. Then its slightly more elegant cousin, the power sword,
yes,
is affectionately, I like to call it the 40K lightsaber, just because that's essentially what it is. It has a button on the handle that you press it, and an energy field called an energy disruption field surrounds the blade that allows it to pass through armor, bone, bulkheads on ships, just about anything. A power weapon can make its way through eventually. Yeah. Essentially, the disruption field allows that weapon to pass through it instead of just cutting through and what you would expect out of a bladed weapon. They're a little bit more elite, a lot more elite weapons for elite soldiers. They're not necessarily as common, but in Space Marines, they're a little bit more common than other places.
Yeah.
You also have, for melee, there's the combat knife, which is, it's a knife.
Big knife.
Yeah, it's a big old knife. If it were held by a normal human, it would look like a short sword. It has a very similar edge to the chainsword. It's that monomolecular edge, but it's not a giant toothed weapon. It's just a big old knife. A lot of these are given to Space Marines as soon as they recover from gene seed implantation, and in some chapters they pass them down through generations and generations as like a relic. Yeah, so you get, after you've recovered from your gene seed implantation, they give you a combat knife, and essentially as a welcome to the ranks.
That's cool.
Here's where you get to start. One final weapon that the Primaris Intercessors can be equipped with is the Astartes pattern grenade launcher. Generally, this will be on 1 out of every 5 Marines in a squad. This has the ability to fire the crack and frag grenades that we mentioned earlier, so it's relatively versatile. And this one, unlike its bolter counterpart, is not a rocket launcher. It is, and to be clear, the bolter's not a rocket launcher, but it does fire rocket-propelled shells.
Yeah.
It fires essentially like a grenade launcher today. It's a ballistic trajectory that you aim, fire, and it takes an arc before hitting its target.
It's extended range grenades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that kind of wraps up most of the generic weapons that Space Marine Intercessor squads are able to utilize in the lore. Riley, if you want to start on the Primaris Marine itself, how are they made? What are they about?
All right. So the Primaris Marines, these are your bigger, your faster, your more resilient Astartes. They're about 8 to 10 feet tall when they're wearing their armor. They are large boys. They have 22 gene seed organs. So the firstborn Marines, they only have 19. But when Call started doing his shenanigans, some of these things include sinew coils that will contract muscles with greater strength.
Yeah, these are basically, take your normal guy with muscles, put hydraulics in his arm, and allow him to lift a bus with ease. It's kind of crazy.
We love it.
Yes.
Let's see. The Magnificat is essentially a magnifier, and this is half of the Immortus organ that the Primarchs have. Call, when doing his shenanigans, couldn't find the other half, but correct me if I'm wrong. This just allows them to see much, much better.
That is essentially the gist that I got from reading about it. The idea is it's an organ that's implanted on the frontal lobe of their brain that takes inputs from their eyes and allows them to see it in either greater detail or greater clarity.
Yeah. So, and lastly, the new additions to the Primaris Marine organs is the Belisarian Furnace.
Just like Call to name it after himself.
Of course. Why wouldn't he? The furnace is connected to the 2 hearts, and it pumps out chemicals to kickstart healing and regeneration. This just makes them even more resilient, makes them able to continue the fight. And when they're in a stressful, messy situation, it's like, let's kick in some extra drugs and let's heal up a little bit, keep going, and keep fighting.
Yeah, essentially, Space Marines already have something similar to this in the Firstborn era, but it takes a little bit longer, it takes a little bit more time to really kickstart, versus the Belisarian Furnace is essentially just the upgraded version of that, where it starts faster and it takes less time to do that regeneration.
Yeah. Once again, Call is just upgrading everything he can.
Exactly.
So speaking of Call, the Primaris Marines come from Call and his shenanigans and playing with test tubes. So he made the Primaris Marines from the original Primarch gene seed. Allegedly, this includes the heretical gene seed, but we don't talk about that, do we?
Yeah, we don't talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it anyway.
Are you sure?
Yes.
I don't think the Inquisition would like this.
I don't care. If you've read the book Dark Imperium, I can't remember which book it is in, but there is a scene where Gilliman is speaking to a simulacrum of Call, and Call is asking him, Gilliman, can I please continue the Primaris project with the gene seed from the heretic Astartes So the 9 fallen legions and the 2 lost ones. And Gilliman told him no. Again, this has been a conversation that they've had multiple times. And Call brings up the fact that, well, Gilliman, you have your own sons that have fallen to chaos. Why should we not use this other gene seed that's also fallen to chaos if we're still using yours? And Gilliman said, no, we only use loyal gene seed. So, Call more than likely used the heretical gene seed already. And there are a couple examples of that, but we're not going to get into that today. So he's probably already done it, but nobody really knows if he's actually done it.
Once again, calling his shenanigans. I mean, so we'll leave that there for now.
Yeah.
This is a non-heresy conversation we're having, so that never happened. Anyway, so firstborn Marines can in fact become Primaris Marines. They do this by crossing what is called the Rubicon Primaris to everyone's favorite poster children, the Blueberry Boys, known as the Ultramarines. This is called the Calgar procedure. And this is because Marnius Calgar, the chapter master of the Ultramarines, was the first to ever cross the Rubicon.
Allegedly.
Oh, yeah.
There are a couple of other people who claim that their chapter master was first. Like, I believe the White Scars claim that as well. But for the sake of conversation, Calgar is relatively safe to assume.
And the way this works is you take firstborn Marine, you cut them into a billion pieces, you give them the new organs, you stitch them back together, cross your fingers, do a few hominas, float some incense around, and hope they wake up. And for Calgar, he did.
Yeah. So when Calgar was preparing to undergo the Rubicon procedure, he asked Belisarius Cawl, like, what is the chances this works? And Cawl told him, there's a 2/3% chance that this will work. It probably won't. But if you want to try it, we'll try it. And Marnius Calgar said, yes, let's do it. So they flayed him alive, put a ton of new organs in him, and then he woke up. He came out of the procedure on the other side as the first Marine to cross the Rubicon Primaris.
Yeah, and we almost see an example of this. We obviously don't see the operation itself, but for anyone that has seen the opening cutscene of Space Marine 2 after the first mission, we see Titus becomes a Primaris Marine in an attempt to save his life after an intense battle that nearly kills him. And in that cutscene, you see all these scars all over his body where they literally just took apart everything and stitched him back together. And he's much larger. And you also even get to see the comparison of the very first mission, he's wearing firstborn armor, but after that, the armor's different. And that's, just an example of the effect of crossing the Rubicon. But that being said, initially we had lots of pure Primaris Marines, and it's taken time, and gradually more and more firstborns are becoming Primaris. So you want to cover training for these guys?
So the training is a little bit interesting for the pureborn, like when they were first made Primaris Marines, that first batch before the Rubicon had been crossed. So as we mentioned earlier, Cawl essentially took the Marines and put them into stasis and experimented on them for 1,000 years or 10,000 years. And where he got them by taking initiates from each legion. So he took people who were aspiring to become Space Marines and took them to Mars instead of sending them to their legions to undergo their individual legion trials. And he took them to Mars, put them in stasis, and essentially ran a lot of different experiments on them and did lots of kind of terrible things to them. But they emerged fully indoctrinated for the specific role that they were to fill, if that was, an intercessor, for example. They're not necessarily the multi-tool that the firstborn Marines were, but they were still very good at their particular craft. Intercessors were a little bit more of that multi-tool style, which is, our specific focus today. They were also extremely inexperienced. They were very green. They didn't really have much combat experience, and they had to prove themselves when they first got out there. But they, as I was mentioning, they were put into stasis, And every once in a while, every couple years or so, they would be pulled out of stasis and they would undergo hypno-indoctrination, which is essentially they tape your eyes open and make you watch all the videos of like bad things happening, that kind of stuff that you see in like horror movies. Hyper indoctrination.
That sounds very death watching.
It does. They did a lot of that, and they also did a lot of experimentation on them to make sure that this project would even work. And eventually, after 10,000 years, they emerged, these shiny new Space Marines, ready to go
Yay.
on a new crusade.
We love it. So yeah, for power scale in the lore, in X cinematic, they are complete, awesome, amazing fighters. But in this other thing, they get absolutely curb stomped. So really, it just depends on the book or the author or whoever's running the form of media that this piece of lore is being produced in. Sometimes, like I said, they're unstoppable forces that will just destroy everything in their path and just can do anything. And other times, they get destroyed by a small gust of wind and get absolutely murdered.
Yeah, and part of that is just literary. The authors are trying to convey a certain point, but it does make them relatively inconsistent. They still are generally the walking one-man army that we know them to be.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, if the author's really trying to prove how powerful a certain enemy is, they are just as flimsy as any standard guardsman.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they are, like you said, they're the rank and file while also trying to be a walking one-man army. But it really depends on what they're fighting and how experienced they may be. And in some cases, how lucky they may be. So the last thing we're going to cover in the lore is just some fun facts and some interesting things that we found while doing some research for this video. So the Death Watch, my personal favorite faction, they had to do some restructuring of their organization to account for the use of Primaris Marines because they run off of a kill team thing, which if you are unfamiliar, we will get into that in a later time. But most notable of this were the new kill team structures of the Fortis and Indomitor kill teams. These using intercessors and heavy intercessors respectively. Current state of the game, neither of these exist anymore, and I cry regularly about it. But the Death Watch did have to do some restructuring because previously they ran only with Firstborn Marines, and the way that their kill teams work, they are specialized.
And then Firstborn Marines as well were a little bit less willing to accept the Primaris Marines into their ranks. I think they were a little bit wary of them. They were worried they were being replaced, which in a sense they were. But they essentially saw them as outsiders that had not, they didn't have the culture. They didn't come from one of the recruiting worlds. They couldn't really be trusted.
They were posers.
Yeah, essentially. And it created essentially a childish tension between them where the Primaris Marines were basically bullied until they proved themselves. And this kind of was even worse in chapters like the Dark Angels, who are inherently untrusting.
What?
They don't like anyone from the outside looking in.
I have no clue what you were talking about. How could they ever be like that?
But let's just say the Dark Angels did not... Well, they received their first shipment of Primaris Marines, but they didn't use them, if you get what I'm saying.
Anyway, Ethan.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the Black Butcher?
I am not familiar with this.
Okay, so the Black Butcher. Once again, this is a Death Watch fact because I cannot cope. He aided kill teams led by Watch Captain Daxus in their battles against orcs of Calverna. And within 6 months of joining the Death Watch, he became fearfully known to the orcs as the Black Butcher.
It's a very orc name.
Yeah. His battle brothers called him Orcsbane. So when Watch Captain Daxus was eventually killed in battle, Leon, who is the name of this intercessor, known as Orcsbane or the Black Butcher, his skill in combat and the trust of his battle brothers earned him the command as Watch Captain in place of Watch Captain Daxus. And ever since then, he has excelled and been an absolute menace. And orcs do not like him. Or maybe they respect him. Who knows?
It's orcs. You can never really tell. I think this is my favorite fun fact personally.
This one's cool.
The Unnumbered Sons. So when the Primaris Space Marines were initially shipped out, about half of them went and created new Primaris-only chapters. This was part of that 26th founding, and they all kind of just went out and did their own thing. These are brand new chapters. The other half, in approximately 9 Legion-sized forces.
And how big is a Legion?
A lot. They're, depending on where you look in the Horus Heresy, Legions can be anywhere from like 30,000 Marines to over 100,000 Marines, depending on what time you're looking at them.
Yeah.
Just in one campaign alone, the Dark Angels lost 50,000 Marines.
Yeah.
So this is a lot of Marines that we're talking about here. And keep in mind, this is half of the Primaris Marines.
Yeah.
So
Call went to work.
Call really went to work. And this is something that I absolutely love. The Unnumbered Sons, as these Legion-sized forces, really provide perspective for how big a project Primaris was. Because it wasn't just like, oh yeah, we get reinforcements and now we're crossing the Rubicon. No, this is, we are getting 18 Legion-sized elements pushed into the Force. We are now back up to Great Crusade level strength as the Imperium with Space Marines. This did, however, because they were in Legion-sized forces, get Gilliman in trouble.
No.
His own book got him in trouble.
No, not
the Codex
the book.
Astartes got Gilliman in trouble, and I think that's the best part of it, because he very much wanted these Legion-sized forces, but people were calling him out and saying, hey, you're trying to be the new emperor because you're violating your own book. So he had to split them up eventually.
Tragic.
Basically, the coolest part about the Unnumbered Sons, they called themselves the Grey Shields. And individual formations and squads had mixed gene lines. So like one squad could consist of an Ultramarine, a Space Wolf, an Iron Hand, a Raven Guard, and an Imperial Fist all crammed together, wearing their own chapter colors on their armor and just going out.
Just vibing.
These are the original Rainbow Marines. I think it's really cool I know I mentioned Dark Imperium earlier, but if you ever go to read, there's some really interesting parts where essentially the squad that I just described are all interacting with each other during downtime. And they're all giving each other crap for, son of Fenris, all you do is kill things and stuff like that. It's really cool that they're all mixed and they all really want to, eventually go out and go join their other chapters, but they're forming these brotherhoods beyond their chapter.
Yeah. I mean, that's at the end of the day, I think one of the big things about Space Marines is they all have this innate pride for their chapter and their Primarch. Whether they know their Primarch or not, or whether they're directly connected to their home chapter or not, they all have this deep pride for it and will always find a way to try and get through. Some of them maybe get a little heretical and don't do what they're supposed to do, but we don't talk about that here because this is not a heresy podcast. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap the lore section, we've essentially established that Space Marines are super elite soldiers that are all variations of walking tanks or one-man armies that have the armament to back it up. And they are, well capable of doing things that no normal person could ever be able to.
Of course. But this is 40K. And in the world of 40K, or the universe of 40K, there's other very scary things out there. So they can't always do what they are meant to do, but they certainly can try.
They certainly can try. And with that, I think that's a good point to move into the tabletop and how the Intercessor datasheet specifically looks and performs.
Yes. So I think, Ethan, you lead this one off.
Okay. So just a disclaimer, we are currently in 10th edition, so all of our comparisons and analysis will be based off of that. We have Codex Space Marines out. It's been out for a long time now. Yep. So we kind of have a pretty good feel for how Intercessors work and what they're capable of. Intercessors, their basic stat line, I'm just going to say it right out, it's okay.
Yeah.
They have a toughness value of 4, it's better than a standard guardsman that's not, wearing power armor or anything, so it's okay.
But it's nothing exceptional. It's not it doesn't stand out.
Right. It's good enough, but it's not that good, if it makes sense. Their armor save is a 3+, and they don't have an invulnerable save. So this makes sense. They're wearing power armor, so they're going to be a little bit tankier, but nothing too crazy. They have a leadership score of 6+, which means that, generally they're able to hold their resolve relatively well. I mean, it's not... Leadership in 10th edition is basically useless, but it's it's okay.
It's pretty standard.
Yeah, in terms of game balancing, it makes sense, and we'll get more into that later. Each model has 2 wounds, which means they can take 2 damage before they die, versus a standard guardsman, which can only take 1. So this is nice. It shows that they're a little bit more resilient. They only do move 6 inches, which is the same as just about every other battle line unit that exists in the game.
Yeah.
So it's not excessive. They just move. Overall, though, this is a good infantry style stat line. They are a little bit tougher, and they are a little bit more heavily armored, but they don't really seem to live up to the super soldier standard, if that makes sense.
No.
They don't really move very fast, even though in the lore they are described as blurs of motion when they're in combat.
Yeah. And I really think it just, and we talked about this in preparation for this episode, it comes down to game balance. If Space Marines were, like the tabletop version, were the equivalent to the lore, the only army that would ever be played is Space Marines, because they're just that good.
Right.
But in order for GW to allow people to play the armies that they are interested in and have it be, somewhat of a fair match, you have to have game balance. So it's a decent stat line. It makes sense for a run-of-the-mill infantry, especially in this faction, but it's nothing to write home about. It's nothing exceptional.
Exactly.
But it's not bad either.
Yeah. So moving into kind of what weapons and options they can take, I'm going to get into their army rule as well a little bit here.
Okay.
But essentially, the Intercessor squad is 80 points for 5 models. Or if you want to take a 10-man squad, it's 160 points. There's only 1 sergeant in the squad, no matter how big it is. And that sergeant will get a special weapon of some kind. Usually that's a melee weapon. And then for every 5 models in the unit, you can have 1 grenade launcher. So they have some weapon options. There's not a lot. It's mostly going to be your bolt rifle and your bolt pistol. There's not a lot going on in terms of weapon options. Talking about the bolt rifle, it's a pretty solid profile that's able to do damage to infantry pretty well. I mean, it's hitting on a 3 when you roll the dice. So that's pretty good. You're hitting 66% of the time. Especially, and this is where I'm going to bring in the army rule, which is Oath of Moment. Essentially what this allows you to do is when you pick a certain target, for every model in your army that makes an attack at that target, you get to re-roll your hit roll.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful.
It's extremely helpful, especially when you're hitting on 3s when you roll dice, because that means every roll of 3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to hit. So when you get to re-roll all your 1s and 2s, that takes your 66% chance up to a much better chance of actually doing what you're trying to do. Again, it doesn't really have a lot going for it in terms of armor penetration or anything like that. It's mostly just a infantry tool. It's not meant to do anything crazy. It does have the heavy keyword though, which is a bonus. Essentially, instead of moving, you can choose to stay stationary. And when you do that, you hit on 2s instead of on 3s. When you add Oath of Moment to that though, hitting on 2s, re-rolling all your 1s, that's a pretty good stat line to have.
Yeah, it allows you to put out some really good shooting. While not necessarily the most damage, you can plop these guys down and just have them there putting out fire consistently.
Yeah, and it's not a lot of fire. I mean, the bolt rifle only has 2 attacks.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be doing a ton, but it does have the ability to do a little bit when you're shooting at infantry. The bolt pistol is essentially the exact same thing, except it only has 1 attack. So really this only exists for when you're in combat and you can't shoot anywhere else. You just pull out the bolt pistol.
Yeah.
It's really not anything special. The only other generic weapon that the Intercessor Squad has access to on the data sheet is the close combat weapon. This is essentially the exact same profile as the bolt rifle in terms of strength, armor penetration, and all that, but you get 1 additional attack, and it's only in melee. Yeah. So you get 3 attacks with it. It's pretty good. I mean, it's not going to do a ton against more tough targets or anything that is like as tough as a Space Marine. Because, yeah, you may be hitting a lot, but you're only going to be wounding 50% of the time. And even then, you don't have any armor penetration, so you're going to be on whatever the enemy unit's armor save is. So you might get a couple wounds through. But really what this is for killing things that are smaller and less tanky than a Space Marine. This will go through and hit those pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be if there's a horde of small stuff trying to surround this squad, pull out the close combat weapon and try and slim
Right.
that force.
Like I have played a game against Tyranids one time with Space Marines that I had, and I had an intercessor squad that got charged by a group of 20 termagants. And they just based off of their armor, they were able to shrug most of the hits. They took a couple wounds, but every time they would hit back, they would pick up 5 or 6 models.
Yep.
And this just lasted and lasted and lasted, and they kept going, and eventually they were able to pick up the squad of termagants before they were destroyed.
Yeah.
So like they do have the ability to deal with hordes pretty well.
Yeah, but you're not going to be charging in against a Carnifex with these
No,
and thinking that you're going to win that fight.
you will not win that fight.
There's a very slim chance you could. Sillier things have happened, but it's very unlikely, and they're going to become a snack for that Carnifex.
Exactly. Let's move into special weapons, though. Again, most of these weapons are going to be hitting on 3s or higher when you roll dice. It's just as good here as it is in shooting, especially when you pair it with that Oath of Moment ability. Most of the special weapons are not really that worth it in the Intercessor squad because they're one-offs. They don't really do much other than there's just one guy who can use, say, a chainsword, which we talked about earlier that the sergeants can have. Chainsword's great in terms of an infantry killer profile. It's got 5 attacks instead of the 3 for the close combat weapon. It's the same strength, but it has better armor penetration, so you're making your opponent's saving throws worse. It doesn't do any more damage, but it's doing a little bit more. It's attacking more, and it's probably going to get through a little bit more just because of that armor penetration. Then you have the sergeant can also take a power sword, which trades attacks for armor penetration and strength. So instead of 5 attacks for a chainsword, the power sword has 4. It is 1 strength higher, so it's 5 strength, and it has AP -2, so you're adjusting the saves even more. It is still only 1 damage, though. So this is a little bit better for targeting your more elite infantry and things that are tougher than Space Marines, but it's still not great. It's not going to be getting a lot through, especially when you only have 1.
Yeah, and that's the big thing with having only one person able to take this like special melee weapon. Regardless of what it is, it's only one person that's able to do it. And so even if you have the guy with the power sword or whatever it may be, you're still not going to be putting out a ton of wounds. It makes the saves harder. Maybe gives you extra attacks, but that's it.
Exactly. And the same kind of goes for the rest of these weapons, so I'll stop beating that dead horse a little bit. But for example, the sergeant can also take a power fist, which is essentially the power sword, but even better. It has only 3 attacks, but it trades it for having almost double the strength at strength 8. Still armor penetration 2, but it does 2 damage instead. So this is arguably one of the better weapons for the sergeant to take in the squad, just because it has more killing power. Even though it doesn't have that many attacks, it's more likely to get those wounds through when you do actually use it.
Yeah.
And the same kind of goes for the Thunderhammer. The Thunderhammer, though, I personally find you really need to pair with Oath of Moment, just because it specifically makes it so that instead of hitting on 3s, you're hitting on 4s. So you're hitting only half the time instead of 2/3 of the time.
But you get the dev wounds.
Right. It's basically the same profile as the Power Fist, but it hits worse and it has devastating wounds, which means when you roll a 6 on your wound roll, you, instead of giving the opponent an opportunity to save that wound, it just automatically does damage through to them. It goes through their armor no matter what. They are very good, they are very situational, and they're very swingy, especially if you only have one of them again. Like, it's not going to do what you want it to do.
Yeah.
So going back into more of what the rest of the squad can have, we have the grenade launcher, which we talked about a little bit earlier. It's still the same versatile weapon that can be anti-infantry or anti-light vehicle. It has D3 attacks, so you roll a dice and divide the result by 2, rounding up, and that's how many attacks you get. The same profile as the bolt rifle, or you can do 1 attack with it at strength 9 with armor penetration 2 and D3 damage to kind of simulate that crack grenade.
Yeah.
It's not a game-changing weapon. It'll get a wound through here and there, but when it does and it counts, that grenade launcher, especially in the crack grenade profile, can potentially be huge.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's an extra chance to get in some chip damage while your other units are doing work.
Exactly.
You know, if you can get, like you said, an extra wound or two on some big unit that's causing problems with that crack profile, it can make a very large difference.
Exactly. We also have the hand flamer, which I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually take a hand flamer.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
It is an option.
It's out there.
It's out there. It's something you can take. You roll a single 6-sided dice to see how many attacks you get. Whatever you roll, that's how many times you hit.
Flamer things.
Because flamers automatically hit. You go straight to the wound roll. The main disadvantage of the hand flamer is it's only strength 3. It has no armor penetration, and it's 1 damage.
Yay.
It's the only things this is going to be useful against is a guy that doesn't have a shirt on and is wandering around with a goat skull on his head.
They're out there.
They are. Cultists are a unit.
Yeah.
The last weapon on the datasheet that intercessors have access to is the plasma pistol. This is only for the sergeant again, but personally, I always take a plasma pistol. I love plasma. That's my own personal bias, but it's a relatively versatile anti-elite weapon that has 2 profiles. You can either fire it normally or you can fire it in hazardous mode. And essentially what that does is the normal mode has strength 7, 2 armor penetration, and 1 damage. Or you can give it a little extra spice and bump that to strength 8, a armor penetration 3, and 2 damage. Which is great. It's awesome. There's no downside whatsoever. Except that maybe if you you'll take a hazardous check after you use the hazardous profile. Yeah. And essentially what you'll do is you roll a d6, a standard dice, and if that roll is a 1, that model takes 3 mortal wounds. It doesn't matter how many wounds that has. If it takes 3 mortal wounds, like if it has less than 3, it automatically dies. Yeah. If it's a character or vehicle, it just takes the 3 wounds. But if you're doing that with intercessors, you can say goodbye to your sergeant because he only has 2.
But it's only if you roll the 1.
And it's only a 1 in 6 chance, and that's why I do it every time.
Well, yeah. And I know we're talking about intercessors today, but it's the same concept with Hellblasters, which are intercessors with big plasma gun. And every time I use them, I only ever roll hazardous. Sometimes it comes to bite me. Other times I roll great. And they just put in work, and getting that extra AP, those extra wounds is so nice.
Yeah, I love hazardous. I use it every time. It has come back to bite me a lot. I remember I played once, I was using my Dark Angels, and I had a squad of Ravenwing Black Knights that had plasma as their weapon.
Yeah.
There were 3 models in the unit. They were 3 wounds apiece. I went to roll the hazardous check after they shot. I rolled 3 1s. The unit self-destructed on its own.
Goodbye.
Yeah, it was hilarious.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so now that we've covered the weapons, we're going to go into some of the abilities that these intercessors have in-game. So the first is objective secured. If you control an objective with intercessors at the end of your command phase, that objective remains under your control until an enemy unit begins a turn on that objective. Sticky objectives.
Yes.
Yes, the classic.
This is your standard battle line ability, which is why I think Space Marines do not live up to the lore.
Yeah.
Because this is a standard battle line ability.
Yeah. A lot of units outside of Space Marines have this. And while intercessors are meant to be this multi-tool that are great at holding things, great at fighting through things, if every other faction has something like this, which again, power scale, make the game playable. But if everyone has something like this, it doesn't make the Space Marine intercessors really stand out.
Exactly. When you have like a squad of Cadian guardsmen that costs 15 points less, 20 points less. Cadian guardsmen are 60 points now. Yeah, they cost 20 points less, and they do the exact same thing at the expense of maybe not shooting as well.
Yeah, but it's the same wounds.
But it's the exact same number of wounds.
Yeah.
It doesn't really feel like it makes sense. It feels like it's just kind of their battle line, give them this.
Yeah.
And this ability is the only reason you bring intercessors in a list. Most army lists aren't going to be taking more than 1 squad of intercessors most of the time, just because they are still 80 points. And that 80 points, if you were to take another unit, could go into something that's a bit more punchy and free up space in your list or give you space to take enhancements.
Yeah, so now we're going to look at, are they actually being taken both competitive and casually in army lists? Very few people on the competitive side are actually taking intercessors because you can get more punchy units like we just talked about, or their cousin, the assault intercessor, that has way more capability in combat. I think it was maybe a small handful of top three finishers in 2024 have had intercessors in the list. And even then, it was only one squad, and they were probably just used for sticky objectives and sitting in the back.
Exactly.
You know, infiltrators are like a popular choice to replace intercessors because they have scout moves, they have things where they can bounce around the field a little more.
Infiltrators specifically also have, instead of a 9-inch deep strike denial that prevents opponents from putting units in your back line, they have a 12-inch deep strike denial.
Yeah.
So it's a much bigger bubble. They do cost more, but you keep your home objective safe for longer.
Definitely. And, you know, this trend is seen at all the opens, the big tournaments.
Yeah, and really, at the big tournaments, you see intercessors a lot in more of the like casual tables that are there.
Yeah.
Even though they are at tournaments, they're in more of like the narrative styles.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get to casual play, it's very rare to see a list that doesn't have intercessors.
And that's because most people that are playing casually started with a starter kit or some type of battle force or combat patrol. And almost all of those include a squad or two of intercessors.
Exactly. They are a staple unit for combo boxes that give you an introduction to the army, so it's very easy to get them and get high quantities of them when you are a new player. And they fit pretty well with the casual style of play. I mean, sticky objectives is huge for casual.
Yeah. And not only that, but if you're like part of the casual being more narrative style of play, intercessors are your rank and file. They're the ones you see on box art, on posters, on everything that has to do with the media of Warhammer. So they're so recognizable. They're not in some different like fancier or bulkier or whatever type of armor. They're the guys, you know.
Exactly.
So people in casual lists are much more willing to take them because they're not worried about insane optimization you can get by switching them for something else. If you already have those models, play with them, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what I do. I started with my Death Watch. I started with some intercessors that came in my starter box, and eventually I kit bashed them and gave them some different weapon options to make them Death Watch veterans. Again, I cry regularly. It's okay. Don't worry about it. But I wanted them to be a little more useful because I wasn't getting the use out of them that my army list needed. But that's not something that has to be done.
Right. I think this kind of brings us to our final comparison. How do we feel the stat line actually lines up?
Did they perform? Are they good? Are they not good? Are they okay? Do they get banished to the Shadow Realm? What do we think?
They're aggressively mediocre.
Yeah.
They're just good enough that you're gonna maybe take one.
Yep.
But they're not good enough that they feel like the walking one-man army, the walking tank. It feels like they're just underwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, they're tougher than guardsmen, so that's cool.
That I would hope they would be.
But they're squishy. And when you look at a 5-man squad of Space Marines versus a 10-man block of guardsmen, it's the same wounds. So they feel kind of squishy.
Yeah, like maybe the guardsmen are going to be wounded a little bit more and they're going to have a harder time saving it, but they're still going to accomplish the same thing at the end of the day.
They are.
There's really not enough difference between them for it to feel like these are these super elite soldiers of humanity. Especially, I think the big thing for me, aside from the ability of sticky objectives, is the 6-inch movement. It feels like they're way too slow.
Yeah.
Because whenever I read about Space Marines in a book, they are always moving at breakneck speeds. In combat, they flash around that they're described as a blur.
Well,
when
you look at like the armor part of the lore, they have stuff built in that makes them more stable, makes them quicker, makes their muscles and everything faster and all this, but they still move at like average speed on tabletop.
Well, and we talked about it in the Gene Seed organs at the new Primaris Marines. Yeah, they have the new sinew coils that allow them to literally contract their muscles harder.
Yeah,
like they should be able to do more, it feels like.
Yeah.
But they don't really seem to meet that same standard. That's just the Marine itself. Their weapons, I still feel a little bit underwhelmed by things like the bolter.
Yeah.
It's a rocket propelled grenade on full auto. I feel like, especially with the way it's described in lore, it's described as only exploding once it's penetrated through the outer layer of whatever the armor target it has. So it's supposed to penetrate and then explode, but they have no armor penetration.
Yeah, like in game, like you just said, there's no AP, and really all they do is they're just plinking shots. They're just hoping something gets through, sending as many shots out as you can, which really you can't send a lot of shots out because what is it? They get 2 shots?
They get 2 shots,
Yeah.
and in a 5-man squad, there's only 4 guys that are going to have bolt rifles
Yeah.
because the sergeant has
Something else.
likely a melee weapon and a plasma pistol because you're building it to have utility.
Yeah.
And that replaces his bolt rifle.
All that being said, though, and us being kind of negative, the chainsword.
Love the chainsword.
Yeah.
I think that they did the chainsword perfectly because it very much feels like this is going to blend the soft target in front of me, and it is going to do it very well.
Yeah. Yeah, the chainsword's great. I love throwing chainswords into anything and everything because if we're in the situation that involves a little bit of melee, I'm confident that they will at least get something done.
Exactly.
Whereas with some of the other weapon options, it's kind of a crapshoot. You don't know if it's going to happen or if, they're just going to be useless.
Yeah. And specifically, the chainsword was made to be the blender against the soft-bodied targets of the Great Crusade. That's where it came from. And that's what it feels like. It feels like if I'm going up against a squad of standard people, I'm going to blend them to shreds, and I'm going to do it in the name of the Emperor.
Oh, yeah.
It feels good. And especially if you get to the more specialized squads that have more chainswords, and you're rolling 25 attacks with chainswords just from a 5-man squad, it feels right.
Yeah.
It is a little bit knocked here in Intercessors because there is only one, but that one does feel good.
Yeah, yeah, and it does do the work. Now, talking about their abilities, with lore and training compared to tabletop, the sticky objectives are great, but it doesn't feel right. And we kind of talked about this when we were initially speaking about this, where most other factions have a battle line unit that does the exact same thing. So in a way, it makes the ability of the intercessors feel underwhelming. Like they should be able to do more.
Right. And I think for me, the sticky objectives wouldn't necessarily feel as bad if they had better killing power. Like if they were able to punch a little bit harder, I'd feel okay about it.
Yeah, because you could get the objective and then move forward to protect it even more and prevent something from getting onto it.
Exactly.
But they just kind of stand there. They don't have the killing power to do much protection.
Exactly. The datasheet itself even says they are meant to, either blitz in and clear bunker complexes or hold ground. But it doesn't really feel like they're able to do that. Their ability kind of covers hold ground a little bit, but again, they don't really have the killing power back.
Yeah. So I think now this is where we come to the final point of, does the unit perform the task on the table as they're described in the lore? What do we think?
No.
Yeah. They don't do it.
They feel like they're meant to be the Emperor's angels that conquer the stars for him, but they feel more like a wet napkin.
Yeah. I agree.
They feel very underwhelming. They feel like Acadian guardsmen with an extra layer of flak armor, not a genetically enhanced super soldier.
As someone who has played into your guard with my Death Watch several times, and now, admittedly, you have a fair number of tanks, so that's different. But still, the amount of times that they get wiped off the board entirely, turn one, is just upsetting.
Well, in some of our first games, and this was in 9th edition, granted, but some of our first games, my Cadian guardsmen would lose like 1 or 2 models to a round of fire from your intercessors.
Yeah.
And inflict the same amount of wounds back.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it felt like they were doing essentially tit for tat matched up together.
Yeah. And we've said it, like, none of this is a knock on, the game design. This is, I think, it makes sense for the game design.
It absolutely does.
And it keeps the game balanced and fair. But when we're here to compare the lore and the description versus the tabletop performance, unfortunately, there's a pretty big gap.
Yeah. In terms of game design, I do honestly think that they nailed it in terms of how they play in their power level. But when you look at the lore, it leaves me wanting more.
100%. 100%. And, we can get into all types of other units that do this. But when these are the guys that are supposed to be the most numerous number of Space Marines, what gives,
Yeah.
So
if you had to give them a rating out of 10, where would you put them?
I personally would put them at a 3.5 to a 4.
Yeah, I was kind of leaning more to like 4, 4.5, just because the chainsword really saves it for me.
Yeah, and I agree that gives them a boost, but when it's only one chainsword for this specific unit,
that is true.
It's almost not enough. But I think 4 is reasonable.
Yeah, I think I can't really justify giving them any higher.
No.
They're still a very fun unit. I do personally still run one, but it doesn't really stack up, I don't think.
No. But all this being said, this doesn't mean completely avoid them at all costs. If you have intercessors already, or you're interested in getting into the hobby, do not let this deter you from this unit, because it's going to be in every bargain box you can find, and that's not a bad thing. It is a great starting point, and it's the very first model I ever painted was an intercessor.
Right.
And I learned so much from that process, from playing. It's really what got me into the hobby. It's just, if you're here for a more competitive thing, or you want to get into a more competitive side and you have some intercessors, start phasing them out. If you're brand new or you're still learning, there is no reason that you should just shelve them and get rid of them. Exactly. You have the models, use the models, have fun.
Exactly. And I've already mentioned, they're not the most powerful, but I still run one. Exactly. Because I enjoy being able to plop somebody on my home objective and kind of forget about it for a little while.
Oh, 100%.
So they do have a place. In terms of game design, we already mentioned, they work pretty well. But for me personally, it's just the lore doesn't quite stack up. I'm still going to take them in my games because I love having the ability to secure my home objective and not worry about it.
Yeah, 100%. So with that, I think this concludes our very first official episode.
Yeah.
Moving forward, we want to stick within the faction of Space Marines for the next couple episodes until we really get our feet on the ground with this whole thing. But we do want to hear from what the viewers may be interested. We have a few ideas, but if there's something that really speaks to you guys that is interesting within kind of the Space Marine infantry, please leave a comment, like the video. The more we hear from you guys, the more we'll be able to meet what you guys are interested, because that's what we're really here for. We love talking about anything and everything 40K, but if we have viewers that are interested in one specific thing, we might as well get that out of the way.
And while our expertise may mostly be Imperial, we're not above talking about the Xenos.
We're both actively starting Chaos armies as well. So we do have plenty of interest in Chaos and Xenos stuff, even though I have sworn off Xenos because Deathwatch. I do think they are very interesting. So
yeah. So if you have anything that you want us to talk about, leave us a comment so that we know that it's something that people are interested in. And once we're through our first couple of episodes of Space Marines, we may start to hop around a little bit, talk about some other things. Yeah,
to keep things interesting for not only you, the viewers, but for us. We will not be doing all of Space Marines straight, because we will be here for a couple years doing that.
And that would be torture.
Yes. So we will bounce around from faction to faction. But yeah, I think without further ado, this will conclude our first episode. Once again, I'm Riley.
And I'm Ethan.
And thank you for joining us on episode 1 of Lost in the World.